The exact moment that gaze met mine, something inside me snapped, like an invisible thread, holding me steady and contained my entire life, had silently broken. There was no explosion, no tremor, just a sudden void, followed by an intense presence. I was standing exactly where I'd always been, in the central aisle of the church, smiling as if everything was under control, as if every step I took had already been written by someone far worthier of deciding for me. The pastor's daughter, the pride of the congregation, the example for the young women of the town. But all it took was a look, a single simple look coming from the back of the church, from a man I'd never seen before, or at least that's what I thought. Because when our eyes met, it felt like a reunion, as if he'd been waiting for me, as if my soul had just remembered something my body had long forgotten. There was nothing scandalous about him. He wasn't particularly handsome nor provocative. He was just attentive, and that was enough to unravel me. Because in that motionless moment between one sentence and the next of my father's sermon, I felt seen in a way no one had ever seen me before. Not as the pastor's daughter, not as the modest young woman, not as the ideal future wife everyone expected me to be. He looked at me as if he knew what lay behind my perfect posture, as if he saw the silences I kept, the desires I locked away, the dreams I never dared name aloud. It was impossible to explain and unthinkable to try. I couldn't tell anyone. How could I explain something so absurd? A stranger looked at me, and inside I collapsed. From a young age, I was taught to avoid temptations, to protect myself from anything that might lead me astray from the path of light. My father said the devil didn't need much. Sometimes a single thought was enough. And maybe he was right. Because what brought me down wasn't a touch, a word, or even an approach. It was a look, a gesture so simple, so subtle, that no one else seemed to notice. But it ignited a quiet fire in me, a timid desire, a dangerous question. What if I don't want this path anymore? What if there's another? What if, deep down, I was never meant to obey, but to choose? It was there, between the wooden pews and the stifling heat of the afternoon, that something inside me began to stir. For the first time in years, I felt, not fear, not guilt, but life. A life that didn't fit the frame they'd painted for me. And what scared me most wasn't that. It was how right it felt, because even without knowing who he was, even without hearing his voice, even without touching him, I knew. That look would change everything. That night, I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling of my room, as if the answers were hidden in the cracks of the old paint. The silence of the house, which used to comfort me, now oppressed me. With every slow breath, it was as if something inside me was knocking at the door, begging to be heard, and ignoring it took almost physical effort. I tried to pray. I tried to recite the verses that always calmed me. I tried to convince myself that it meant nothing, that it was just imagination, exhaustion, a silly slip of the heart. But the more I tried to stifle it, the more alive the feeling became. The image of that look replayed in my mind like an echo. It wasn't about beauty. It wasn't about attraction. It was about recognition, about what happens when someone sees you wholly, without asking permission, without invading, just sees. And that scared me more than any sin I'd ever heard of. In the days that followed, I did everything to act as I always had. I smiled during choir rehearsals. I helped with church activities. I responded to the kind comments from the older women in the community who looked at me with pride, as if they already knew the future they'd planned for me. And outwardly, I pretended it was enough. But inside, everything about me was different. A sweet and dangerous discomfort followed me constantly. I saw him around, the stranger. Sometimes at the market, other times just crossing the street. He never tried to approach, never said anything. But his gaze found me, as if he knew exactly where I'd be. And every time it happened, the ground beneath my feet felt less steady. It wasn't a game. It wasn't pursuit. It was just presence. A silent presence that made more noise inside me than any shout. I began to notice myself as I never had before. My gestures, the thoughts that surfaced when I was alone, the questions I'd long forbidden from growing. Was my life truly mine? Did my faith come from within? Or was it just a reflection of my fear of disappointing others? And who would I be if no one saw me as the pastor's daughter? Who would I be outside the shadow of the name I carried? It was hard to admit, but the truth was forming like a storm. That man hadn't brought doubts. He'd ignited a truth I'd been hiding for a long time, and that was what scared me most. The day everything began to change didn't come with a warning. It arrived like every other morning, with the sound of the kettle whistling in the kitchen, my father's heavy footsteps heading to the porch with his Bible in hand, and my mother's voice softly humming hymns as she sliced fruit at the counter. But inside me something was simmering, a kind of silent urgency, as if time was running out, and I needed to decide whether I'd keep being the same or have the courage to find myself. I went for a walk, as I did from time to time, pretending it was just for fresh air. The truth was, I already knew. I knew he'd be there, at the same spot I'd seen him days before, near the old bookstore in town. I don't know how, but I knew, and he was. Sitting on a wooden bench, head bowed as if carrying the weight of the world on. His shoulders. This time I didn't look away. I approached slowly, my heart pounding as if it might betray me at any moment. He raised his eyes and saw me again. But there was something different, something broken and at the same time steady, as if he was tired of running and ready to listen. We didn't exchange words right away. We stood there facing each other in a silence so full of meaning that I still lack words to describe it. The entire world seemed to have lowered its volume, and only that moment remained, that moment between who I was and who I could be. He spoke first. His voice was softer than I'd imagined. It carried weight, but also a care that disarmed me completely. He asked if I knew what I was doing. I didn't know how to answer, because the truth was, I didn't know. I only knew what I didn't want to be anymore, and for the first time in my life, that felt like a truer beginning than any certainty I'd ever had. We sat side by side and spoke little. It wasn't about words. It was about permission, about allowing myself to be there, whole, without armor. And in that moment, without promises, without confessions, without vows of love, I understood that the look that had once held me wasn't a prison. It was a window, an opening to a world I didn't yet know, but that perhaps, just perhaps, was mine. It started with small deviations. A different route home, lingering longer in the square, a borrowed book from a shelf I'd never noticed before. Simple things, but to me, they carried the weight of a revolution. I'd always been the daughter who did everything right, who said yes with a soft voice and lowered eyes, who followed the right steps without asking where they led. But with him, with that man no one in town really knew, every gesture felt like a step off the line. And yet, truer than anything that came before. We didn't talk much, and when we did, the words came heavy with pauses. He was a man of long silences, and for the first time, I felt I could exist within them. I didn't need to explain who I was. I didn't need to defend myself from anything. He listened even to what I didn't say. He spoke little about himself, but when he did, it was with rare care, like someone holding something fragile in their hands. I learned his name was Elias, and just the way he said it was already different from everything I knew, without urgency, without embellishment. Elias, as if it was enough, and it was. He came from far away, carried a past he didn't reveal all at once, but let slip in fragments, losses, guilt, inherited silences. And curiously, that's what brought us closer. Not what we knew about each other, but everything we didn't yet know and still wanted to discover. I started noticing looks in town, some suspicious, others clearly judgmental. The church ladies, who once greeted me with warmth, now averted their eyes. My father watched me in silence, as if trying to decipher a crack in me. And there was one. Only he didn't know that crack wasn't a flaw. It was a crevice through which light was entering for the first time. Every time I saw Elias, it felt like I was opening an internal door that had been locked for years. But the cost of it was starting to reveal itself. That town, that community, that church. They weren't built to accept doubts. And a pastor's daughter with her eyes turned toward a strange man was more than an inconvenience. It was unforgivable. The night my mother called me to talk, she used a tone I only knew from moments when something was about to collapse. She spoke about reputation, about caution, about the weight of choices. She said she was worried about me, that people were starting to talk. But what broke me was her look. More than fear of what I might do, there was a deep sadness, as if she knew exactly what I was feeling and hadn't had the courage to choose differently when she'd had the chance. And it was there, in the midst of it all, that I understood. The story I thought was just beginning with Elias was in truth the continuation of something that had always been inside me. He wasn't the cause of the change. He was the mirror. And in the reflection, I saw a version of myself I didn't know existed, but that, even trembling inside, was finally starting to walk on her own legs. Things started to hurt in a new way. It wasn't just the restlessness from before, that silent doubt lurking in the corners of my mind. Now it was concrete. It was the discomfort of forced smiles at church services, the shift in tone of the voices greeting me, the heavy silence between my father and me. I'd become a question mark where there had only been certainty before, and as much as that broke my heart, especially seeing his disappointed look, as if I were destroying something sacred, a part of me refused to back down. Because there, in the midst of rejection and discomfort, I was finding something no approval had ever given me truce. Elias and I started meeting more often, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. It was as if the world around us was pushing us away, and only in the space we created together could I breathe fully. We talked about everything and about nothing. He shared fragments of his story, always with a calm that contrasted with what lay behind the words. He'd served in the military, lost a brother he never got over, and spent years trying to forget where he came from. He lived off small jobs, carried old books, and kept a notebook where he wrote stray thoughts, like prayers without an address, a man in reconstruction. And I saw myself in him more than in any reflection I'd ever found in a mirror. It was on one of those afternoons that he looked at me differently. There wasn't just curiosity or care anymore. There was pain and a silent courage. He said maybe it was better if I stayed away, that he didn't want to hurt me, that my world was too clean to carry the ghosts that walked with him. But what he didn't know was that my world only seemed clean because I'd spent my whole life cleaning the stains others told me I couldn't have. I was tired of pretending purity when what I wanted was truth. So for the first time, I was me. I looked at him and said, with every word, that what would truly hurt me wasn't being by his side. It was going back to a place where I had to hide to be accepted. From that moment, something between us changed. It wasn't reckless passion. It was something deeper. A silent pact between two wounded hearts that still chose to draw closer. But there was no hiding it for long. The town started talking louder. People who were once close began to drift away. My father called me into his study, his tone grave, and with a pain that almost made me give up, he said, "Faith, do you know what you're doing with your life?" And I wanted to answer clearly. I wanted to ease his pain. But all I could say was, for the first time, "I think I do." The day my father took the pulpit with heavy eyes and a voice colder than ever was the same day I understood the real cost of freedom. No names were spoken, no explicit accusations made, but every word in that sermon about crooked paths, impure influences, the danger of straying from the light, was a blade aimed directly at me, and everyone knew. Every averted glance, every awkward silence at the end of the service confirmed what was already undeniable. I no longer belonged there. Not as I had before. Not in the way they'd shaped me. I got home and found my mother sitting on the porch, hands clasped in her lap, staring at the sky as if searching for an answer the earthly world no longer gave her. She didn't look at me when I approached, and I didn't speak either. Because what could I say? That I was falling in love with someone they didn't accept? That the path that felt closest to God now was the furthest from the church? That for the first time, I felt peace in the confusion, not in the dogmas. It all hurt. But what hurt most was knowing that to find myself, I'd have to let go of almost everything that had formed me. I met Elias that night. We walked in silence to the edge of town, where the sound of cars faded and only the sound of our footsteps remained. He looked at me with the saddest eyes I'd ever seen. He said maybe it was time for him to leave, that he'd stayed too long, that he didn't want to be the reason I'd break every tie I'd built. But what he didn't know, what I only understood in that moment, was that my decision was already made. Not for him, but for me. It wasn't an escape, it was a crossing. And no matter how much it hurt, I wouldn't go back to being a shadow of myself to fit anyone's mold. That night I kissed Elias for the first time, not as an escape, not as a delirium, but as an affirmation. A calm, lingering, conscious kiss. A kiss from someone who knew exactly what she was doing. A kiss that didn't take anything from me. It only gave back everything that was mine by right. My body, my voice, my story. And when we pulled apart, still with our eyes closed, I felt something inside me align. There was no going back. And as terrifying as that was, it finally felt right. I thought the worst would be the judgment. I thought it would be the harsh words, the closed doors, the disapproving looks from the community that once called me an example. But it wasn't. What hurt most was the silence. The silence of my father, who began crossing the hallway without looking at me. The silence of my mother, who now spoke only what was necessary, as if any extra sentence might crumble the little that remained. The silence of my own home, which used to be filled with predictable routines, and now felt like a place where even the walls avoided making noise. That kind of silence screams, and I learned to listen to it. In the days that followed, there was a kind of mourning, not for a person, but for an entire life I could no longer live. My church commitments were canceled without explanation. The girls I grew up with avoided crossing my path. The women who once called me a blessing now whispered among themselves when I passed. And yet, in the midst of this isolation, I felt something new. Firmness. Not because it was easy, but because I finally knew I was living in alignment between what I felt and what I showed. Elias stayed, not as a savior, nor as an escape, but as someone who looked at me without trying to fix me. It was strange to discover love like this, without haste, without labels, without the need to prove anything to anyone. Love with him was space. It was listening. It was presence. We didn't have a plan, nor promises of forever. We had only the daily choice to be there, together, even in the face of a world that preferred to see us apart. It was on an afternoon, as we walked along a rarely used road outside town, that Elias said something I'll never forget. He stopped, looked at me with that gaze full of shadow and light, and said, "You didn't choose to fall. You chose to rise." And in that moment, I realized he saw not only who I was now, but everything I had to die to become this woman. He knew the cost, because he'd paid it too. Reconciliation with my parents didn't come right away, nor with the town. Maybe it never would fully. But one day, after months of silence, I found my mother sitting on the porch with a notebook in her lap. She looked at me and her eyes were full of exhaustion, but also something softer, and she said, "I don't understand what you did, but I'm trying not to lose you because of it." That was more than forgiveness. It was an opening, a crack in the wall where maybe one day light could enter for them too. Life after the rupture didn't come with flowers or immediate rewards. It came with silence, long nights, and a strange emptiness that sometimes tried to disguise itself as regret, but couldn't. Because deep down, even with all the losses, I felt something I'd never felt before: peace. Not the passive peace that comes from pleasing others, but the kind that's born from truth, even when it hurts. I woke up every day not knowing exactly what to expect, but for the first time, I woke up as someone whole. Not the molded, tamed, projected version meant to fit, but me. Faith, with flaws, with fears, with my own choices. And that was liberating. Elias started living closer, not under the same roof, but within reach of touch, of daily conversation, of shared routine. He taught me to cook simple things, to enjoy books that weren't in the church library, to listen to music without guilt, to lie on the grass and look at the sky as if I believed answers could be found there. But the most beautiful thing was that he didn't try to teach me anything. He just lived and let me live too. And in the midst of that silent freedom, we found each other. I discovered that love could be light, even when the world said otherwise. That true love doesn't demand, doesn't require, doesn't bind. It just stays. I started working at a small shop in the neighboring town. There, no one knew me as the pastor's daughter. There, I was just Faith, with my name embroidered on my apron and a shy smile that gradually gained courage. It was tiring, simple, but real. And every day, as I closed the shop, I felt part of the world, not just a spectator of a life others had written for me. Sometimes customers looked at me with kindness. Other times they passed by as if I were invisible. And even so, I felt alive. Because it was no longer about being approved. It was about being authentic. There were hard days. I cried alone more times than I can count. I missed my mother, my father's voice singing hymns at dusk, the feeling of belonging. But I understood that longing isn't the same as a mistake. You can love where you came from and still move forward. You can honor the story and still write a new one. And even when everything felt unstable, when loneliness threatened to envelop me, all I had to do was remember the moment I chose not to be a shadow anymore, and that gave me strength. It was on this path, full of curves and scars, that I began to feel free. Not because I'd broken with everything, but because I'd allowed myself to rebuild from what remained. Because sometimes what remains is exactly enough. The end didn't come as a full stop. It came as a long breath after years of holding it in. It wasn't a grand event, nor a dramatic revelation. It was just an ordinary day when for the first time I noticed that the pain had made room for calm, and that I no longer needed to fight to be who I am. We were sitting in the backyard of the small rented house. Elias reading slowly, me sewing a dish towel my mother would have smiled to see. And it was there, in that utterly ordinary moment, that I realized I had built a life, not perfect, not approved by everyone, but mine. My father still didn't talk much with me. When we saw each other, he kept his posture firm, his gaze more tired than judgmental now. But there was a moment, months later, when he showed up at the shop's door, bought a candle, and said in a low voice, "Your mother says you're doing well." That was all, and it was a lot. I smiled. I didn't ask for more, because now I knew sometimes love is just that. Quiet presence, softened resistance, the seed of a future reunion. Elias remained the same man of deep silences. Sometimes I caught him looking at me as if he still couldn't believe I'd stayed. And I stayed every day, because choosing to be by his side was never about rebellion or impulse. It was about reunion. He didn't save my life. He showed me I could save it myself. He looked at me in a way that reminded me of everything I was before the world taught me to be silent. And for that, I stayed. Not out of dependence, but by choice. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see another woman. I still have the same features. I still carry my father's last name. I still know by heart the verses I learned as a child. But now there's something new in my reflection. There's truth. There's a quiet firmness in my eyes, as if I'd finally found myself at that crossroads between what was expected of me and what my heart had been whispering for years. And every time Elias looks at me, with that same look from the first day, I smile. Because I know it wasn't love that bound me. It was love that set me free. If I could write a letter to that version of myself who once felt broken for simply wanting more, I'd say, breathe. Don't rush to understand everything now. Some answers will only come when you have the courage to let the questions hurt a little longer. I know you'll feel alone, that you'll question every step off the line, that fear will whisper louder than your faith, and that sometimes it'll seem easier to just keep obeying. But don't be fooled. Obedience without truth is another form of prison, and you weren't born to live chained to the dreams of others. You'll lose things, yes, and it'll hurt. Some people will pull away. Others will speak as if they know you better than you know yourself. But you'll learn that the value of a life isn't in how many hands applaud you, but in how many nights you can sleep in peace with your choices. And that peace, that rare, silent, powerful peace, will come. It'll come when you're sitting with empty hands but a full heart. It'll come when you realize you built a new story with pieces you picked up from the ground, with tears, with firmness, with stubborn hope. Elias didn't come to rescue you. He appeared to remind you that there's love in the world that doesn't demand you disappear to be accepted. Love that looks and doesn't judge, that listens before correcting, that stays without needing to dominate. And as much as your story began with a look that held you, it only had that power because you were already ready to be seen. Today, when I look at the road behind me, I don't see scandal or regret. I see courage, a quiet, stubborn courage. And if I could give you advice, to you who might be living this now, it would be this. Never underestimate the power of a heart that chooses to be true, even when the cost seems high. Because one day, you'll look at yourself and smile. You'll remember where you came from, everything you lost, and you'll realize that in the end, what you gained was freedom, and freedom is the most beautiful name love can have.